It was one of those courtrooms that felt like it hadn't seen a fresh breath of air since the '70s. You know the smell? Old paper, floor wax, and that heavy, stifling scent of nervous sweat. I sat there, hunched over in the back row, wearing a faded hoodie that was just a little too big and a pair of scuffed sneakers. To anyone looking, I was just another kid caught in the system, just another face that didn't matter. But under that hood, my heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I wasn't just a kid. I was there with a purpose, a digital recorder sewn into the lining of my jacket and a mind sharpened by years of law school. The judge, a man named Miller, didn't even look up when the bailiff called the next case. He was shuffling papers, his face set in this permanent mask of boredom and disdain. It's a look I've seen too many times. It's the look of a man who stopped seeing people a long time ago and started seeing files. When I stood up and walked toward the defense table, I felt his eyes finally snap toward me. It wasn't a gaze. It was a weight. It felt like being pushed back by an invisible hand. "Name for the record," Miller sighed, his voice echoing off the wood-paneled walls. He sounded like he was ordering a coffee he knew he wouldn't like. "Maya." "Maya Jenkins," I said. I made sure my voice shook just a little. That wasn't hard to do. The fear was real, even if the crime, a trumped-up loitering charge I'd orchestrated with a local shopkeeper, wasn't. I looked down at my shoes, playing the part of the intimidated teenager perfectly, because I knew, in that building, in that specific room, being vulnerable was like blood in the water. Miller leaned forward, his black robes billowing. He looked like a vulture perched on a high branch. "Well, Maya, you're back, or you're the first of a dozen today who look exactly like you. Hard to tell from where I'm sitting." The room went silent. I mean the kind of silence that rings in your ears. I felt the court reporter pause for a split second, a tiny hitch in the rhythm of her typing. I didn't look up, but I felt the heat rising in my neck. It wasn't just the words, it was the casual way he threw them out, like I was a glitch in his day, like I was a statistic that had dared to take up space in his sightline. This was exactly why the Bar Association had sent me. They'd heard the whispers, they'd seen the sentencing disparities, but hearing it, feeling it directed at you, that's something no law book can prepare you for. I'm sorry, Your Honor," I whispered. I forced myself to look him in the eye. I wanted him to see me, truly see the human being he was dismissing. He laughed. It wasn't a warm sound. It was sharp, like glass breaking under a boot. "Don't give me the wide-eyed act, girl. I've seen it 1,000 times. You spend your nights on the corner looking for trouble, and then you come in here and play the innocent child. It's tired. You're tired." He turned to the prosecutor, a young man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. "What do we have, loitering? Failure to disperse? Let's just skip to the part where I tell her she's headed for a cell and we all go to lunch." I stood there, my hands gripped so tight on the edge of the table that my knuckles were white. I could feel the eyes of the other defendants in the gallery. I could feel their collective breath held. They knew this dance. They'd been stepped on before. But as Judge Miller continued to mock my future career prospects and my obvious lack of guidance, I realized that the man wasn't just biased. He was certain. He was so certain of his superiority that he didn't even think he had to hide it. He felt untouchable. And that, more than anything, was what I needed to document. The prosecutor cleared his throat, a dry, raspy sound that barely cut through the tension. He started to read the facts of the case, but Miller interrupted him within seconds. The judge wasn't interested in facts. He wanted to perform. He leaned back, spinning his chair slightly, a small, smug smile playing on his lips as he looked at me. "Tell me, Maya," he said, his voice dripping with a fake paternal concern that felt slimier than outright anger. "What was the plan for that night? Were you waiting for a bus that never comes, or were you just waiting for someone to sell you something that would make you forget you have no future?" I felt a surge of genuine white-hot fury. It started in the pit of my stomach and raced up my spine. My hands were trembling, and this time it wasn't an act. I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from reciting the 14th Amendment right then and there. I had to remember why I was sitting in this uncomfortable chair wearing these clothes. I was a mirror. That was my job. I had to reflect him until he showed every crack in his soul. I was just standing by the bodega, sir," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I wasn't doing anything wrong." "Sir?" Miller mocked, tilting his head. "Oh, we have manners now." Manners usually show up right around sentencing time. It's funny how that works. You spend your life shouting over sirens, but you get in front of a mahogany bench, and suddenly you're a choir girl. He leaned over the desk, his face red and eyes bulging. You people always think the rules are suggestions. You think the sidewalk is your living room. Well, not in my city. Not today. You people. There it was. The two words that acted like a branding iron. I saw the court reporter's fingers stumble again. I looked over at the bailiff, a man who had probably stood in that same spot for 20 years. He was looking at the floor, his face a blank mask of practiced indifference. He'd heard I.T. all before. That was the most heartbreaking part, the normalization of it, the way the air in the room didn't even ripple when a man tasked with justice threw a slur-adjacent generalization at a child. I took a shaky breath, letting my shoulders slump. I needed him to go further. I needed him to feel so comfortable in his prejudice that he'd say the things he usually only whispered at his country club. I want to go to college, I said, looking up with watery eyes. I want to be a lawyer. The laughter that erupted from the bench wasn't just loud, it was cruel. It was the kind of laugh that stays with a kid for the rest of their life, the kind that kills dreams before they even have a chance to breathe. Miller actually had to wipe a tear from his eye. A lawyer? You? Maya, let's be realistic. The only way you're getting into a law firm is with a mop and a bucket, and even then I'd tell them to lock the cabinets. The gallery gasped. A woman in the second row, probably someone's mother, let out a soft "Lord have mercy." Miller snapped his head toward her. Quiet in my court, or you can join her in the holding cell. I'm tired of the theatrics. He turned back to me, his eyes cold and dead. You have no idea what it takes to stand where I stand. You don't have the discipline, the intellect, or the pedigree. You're just a girl from the blocks who got caught. Own it. It's the only honest thing you'll ever do. I felt the digital recorder against my skin, a cold piece of plasty. See, that felt like a shield. Every word he spoke was another nail in his career's coffin. But God, it hurt. Even knowing it was a sting operation, even knowing I had a JD from Columbia and a license to practice in 3 states. Being told I was nothing, over and over, started to chip away at the edges of my identity. I felt the weight of every person who had ever stood in this spot without my protection. I felt the ghosts of every Maya who had been crushed by his gavel. Please, Your Honor, I pleaded, leaning into the role. Just a fine. I'll work it off. I have a job at the library. The library? Miller sneered, closing the file with a final echoing thud. I doubt you can even read the titles. No, Maya. I think a week in juvie will give you some time to reflect on your career goals. Maybe you can practice your opening statements for the guards. They love a good joke. He picked up his gavel. This was the moment. The moment where he would cross the line from difficult judge to human rights violation. He held it poised in the air, looking at me like I was something he'd stepped in on the street. I waited, my heart stopping, waiting for the sound of the wood hitting the block. The gavel didn't fall. Not yet. Miller held it there, suspended in the air, savoring the power he held over a girl he thought had no one in the world to call. He seemed to enjoy the way I was trembling, though he didn't realize it was from a mixture of cold fury and the sheer adrenaline of what I was about to do. I looked at the clock on the back wall. It was 11:15 a.m. In 5 minutes, the lunch recess would begin. In 5 minutes, his world would end. You know, Miller said, his voice dropping to a conversational, almost intimate tone that was somehow more terrifying than his shouting. I see your type every day. You think the world owes you something because it's hard. But the world doesn't care. I don't care. You're a drain on the system, Maya. A drain on the taxpayers. A drain on my patience. I let a single tear roll down my cheek. I didn't have to force it. I was crying for the boys and girls who had sat here before me and didn't have a law degree in their back pocket. I was crying for the sheer, ugly unfairness of it all. I just wanted a chance, I whispered. Chances are for people who deserve them, he snapped. And you? You deserve a reality check. 1 week in the detention center. Bail is set at $5,000. Since I know you don't have 5 cents to your name, I suggest you start getting used to the smell of industrial cleaner. He slammed the gavel down. Crack! The sound echoed like a gunshot. The bailiff stepped forward, reaching for his handcuffs. I felt the cold metal brush against my wrist, and that was it. That was the line. I stood up straight. The slouch vanished. The trembling stopped. I didn't move my hands. I just looked the bailiff in the eye with a gaze that made him pause. It wasn't the look of a frightened teenager. It was as the look of a predator who had finally closed the trap. "Take your hands off me, officer," I said. My voice wasn't a whisper anymore. It was clear, resonant, and carried the authority of someone who spent their mornings arguing before the appellate court. The bailiff froze. He looked at me, then at the judge, confused. The courtroom went dead silent. Even the court reporter's keys stopped clicking. "What did you say?" Miller barked, leaning so far over his bench I thought he might fall off. "Sit down and shut up, or I'll add contempt to your list of problems." I didn't sit down. I reached into my oversized hoodie and pulled out a small, laminated card. I didn't toss it. I walked it over to the bench and placed it directly on the mahogany wood, right next to his gavel. "My name is Maya Jenkins-Ross," I said, my voice steady and cold as ice. "I am a senior investigator for the State Bar Association's Judicial Oversight Committee. And you, Judge Miller, are currently being recorded on 3 separate devices." I watched the color drain from his face. It was a slow process. First, the ruddy red of his anger turned to a sickly gray. Then, his eyes dropped to the ID card. I saw his pupils dilate as he read the words Bar Association and Internal Affairs. He looked up at me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. This is some kind of joke," he stammered. "A prank. You're the loitering defendant. The loitering was a controlled scenario." "Oh, sanctioned by the district attorney's office," I replied, crossing my arms. I felt the power in the room shift. It was like a physical tide pulling away from him and rushing toward me. "The loitering isn't the issue here, David. The issue is the mop and bucket comment. The issue is the you people comment. The issue is the fact that you just sentenced a minor to a week in detention without a defense attorney present, while mocking her racial identity and her intelligence." I turned to the gallery. People were standing up. Someone started filming on their phone. The bailiff had backed away, his hands held up as if to say he was just following orders. "I've been in your courtroom for 3 days, Judge," I continued, stepping closer to the bench. "I sat in the back. I watched you belittle a grandmother because she couldn't speak English fast enough. I watched you give a maximum sentence to a boy for a first-time possession charge while giving a stern warning to a white kid for the exact same offense an hour later. But today you gave me everything I needed." Miller tried to regain his composure. He straightened his robe, but his hand was shaking so badly he could barely tuck it into his lap. You can't do this. This is entrapment. This is a violation of judicial privilege." "No," I said, and for the first time I let a small, grim smile touch my lips. "This is an audit, and you just failed." The silence that followed was heavy, almost physical. It was the sound of a man's career crashing into 1,000 pieces. Miller looked down at the ID card as if it were a poisonous insect. He didn't touch it. He just stared. His breathing had become shallow, a sharp wheezing sound that cut through the absolute stillness of the room. I could see a bead of sweat roll down from his temple, disappearing into the collar of his expensive silk shirt. The vulture was gone. In his place sat a terrified old man who had finally realized the world wasn't as small as his bench. "Miss Jenkins," he started, his voice cracking. He tried to clear his throat, tried to find that booming, authoritative tone he used to crush people, but it was gone. It had deserted him. "I think there's been a massive misunderstanding. The pressure of the docket, the heat. I was merely trying to use a bit of tough love to steer a young person away from a life of crime. It's a technique, a pedagogical approach." "Pedagogical?" I repeated the word slowly, letting it hang in the air like a bad smell. "Is that what you call telling a young girl she's only fit for a mop and a bucket? Is that tough love, or is that just your soul leaking out of your mouth?" I didn't wait for an answer. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I hit a single button. "They're coming in now," I said into the receiver. The double doors at the back of the courtroom swung open with a bang. 2 men and a woman, all dressed in sharp, dark suits and carrying briefcases, marched down the center aisle. They didn't look like defendants. They didn't look like they were afraid of anything. They were the cleanup crew. My team. The lead investigator, Marcus, a man with graying hair and a face carved from granite, didn't even look at Miller at first. He walked straight to the court reporter. "Stop the record," he said firmly, "and secure that transcript. It is now evidence in a formal inquiry by the Commission on Judicial Conduct." The reporter looked at Miller, her eyes wide. Miller didn't say a word. He looked like he'd been turned to stone. Marcus then turned to the bench. "Judge Miller, you are hereby served with an emergency suspension order. You are to vacate this bench immediately. Your chambers are being sealed as we speak." "You can't do this." Miller finally found his voice, but it was a pathetic, high-pitched wail. He stood up, his chair skidding back and hitting the wall. "I am a sitting judge. I have tenure. I have friends in the legislature. And I have a recording of you mocking a child's race and future," I said, stepping forward so I was standing directly beneath him. I had to look up, but for the first time in that room, I felt like the one on the high ground. "Those friends of yours? They're going to be very busy pretending they never knew your name. No one wants to be the face of a civil rights scandal in an election year, David." I looked around the room. The bailiff had completely stepped away from me, standing by the wall with his head down. The prosecutor was frantically packing his files, looking like he wanted to phase through the floor. The people in the gallery, the real people, were silent. They weren't cheering. Not yet. It was too much to process. They were watching a god fall, and it turns out gods are remarkably small when you take away their lightning bolts. I felt a hand on my shoulder. It was Marcus. "You okay, Maya? That was a long 3 days." I took a deep breath, the first one that didn't feel like I was choking on dust. "I'm fine," I said, though my heart was still racing. I need to get out of these clothes. I need to feel like myself again." As I turned to walk away, Miller called out. It wasn't a threat this time. It was a plea. "Jenkins, wait. We can talk about this. I can make it right. I'll dismiss all the cases from this morning. Just don't send that tape to the press." I stopped at the bar, the little wooden gate that separates the important people from the rest of the world. I didn't turn around. "It's not just about the tape, Judge. It's about the fact that you thought you could say those things because you thought I was nobody. You thought I didn't have a voice. But the thing is, everyone in this room has a voice. You just spent 20 years making sure they were too afraid to use them." I pushed through the gate. I walked past the woman who had whispered, "Lord, have mercy," earlier. She reached out and squeezed my hand as I passed. Her palm was warm, and her eyes were full of something I hadn't seen in this building since I started the assignment: hope. I walked out of those heavy oak doors and into the bright, blinding sunlight of the courthouse steps. The air was hot, but it felt clean. Behind me, I could hear the chaos starting to erupt, the shouting, the reporters who had been tipped off, the sound of a system finally being forced to look at its own reflection. I pulled the hoodie off, revealing my professional blouse underneath. I smoothed my hair. I wasn't the scared teen anymore. I was a weapon of justice, and I wasn't done. Miller was just the first name on a very long list. The marble steps of the courthouse felt different under my feet as I walked down. For 3 days I'd climbed them feeling like a target, shoulders hunched, eyes tracing the cracks in the stone to avoid the cold stares of the security guards. Now the sun was hitting the plaza with a fierce, honest heat. I pulled out my phone and called my supervisor at the Bar Association. My hand was finally steady. "It's done," I said, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears, sharper, more certain. He went further than we ever expected. He didn't just show bias, he showed a complete lack of basic humanity. "I have it all." "Good work, Maya," Sarah replied, her voice crackling with a mixture of relief and professional gravity. "Get back to the office. The press has already caught wind of the suspension. The sharks are in the water." As I walked toward car, I saw the first wave of news vans pulling up to the curb. Reporters were spilling out, adjusting ties and shouting into headsets. They didn't recognize me. To them, I was just another passerby in a blazer, another face in the downtown rush. They were looking for the underprivileged teen they'd heard about in the tips. They didn't realize she was already gone, replaced by the woman who had set the fire. I sat in my car for a moment, the engine idling, the air conditioning blasting cold air into my face. I looked at myself in the rearview mirror. My eyes were red-rimmed. I realized then that I wasn't just tired, I was grieving. I was grieving for the version of me that had to endure those insults, and for the thousands of people who didn't have a badge to protect them when the doors closed. I thought about Miller's face when he realized who I was. It wasn't remorse. It was the look of a gambler who had finally been caught with an extra card up his sleeve. My phone started buzzing incessantly. Notifications from news apps were already popping up. Breaking: longtime Judge David Miller suspended amid allegations of gross misconduct. The comment sections were already a battlefield. Some were calling for his head, Others were defending his years of service, claiming a sting operation was a bridge too far. They hadn't heard the tape yet. They hadn't felt the way his voice turned into a whip when he looked at a young black girl. I drove back to the office in a daze. "Tuh!" He said. He moved around me like nothing had changed. People were buying hot dogs, hailing cabs, arguing over parking spots. They had no idea that a few blocks away, a tiny corner of the world had just been forcibly corrected. When I walked into the Bar Association headquarters, the lobby was unusually quiet. Then, someone started clapping. It started with the receptionist, then a few clerks, and then Marcus, who had beaten me back to the building. I stood there clutching my bag, feeling a sudden wave of embarrassment. I didn't want a standing ovation. I wanted a shower. I wanted to scrub the feeling of Miller's tough love off my skin. "The board wants a full briefing in an hour," Marcus said, walking over to me. He looked older in the office light, the lines on his face deeper. "But Maya, you did something today. You didn't just catch a bad judge. You gave the community a reason to believe the system can actually look at itself in the mirror." "He told me I was only fit for a mop and a bucket, Marcus," I said, my voice dropping. The office noise faded away. He said it with so much conviction. He really believed it. "How many lives has he ruined because of that belief?" Marcus sighed, a heavy, weary sound. "We're going to find out. Every case he's touched in the last 5 years is being flagged for review. It's going to be a long year, Maya. A lot of people are going to be going home because of what you recorded today." I nodded, feeling the weight of that responsibility. It wasn't just about one man's downfall. It was about the slow, painful process of unmaking the damage he'd done. I went to my desk and opened my laptop. The first thing I did wasn't a report. I looked up the file for the boy Miller had sentenced earlier that week, the one with the first-time possession charge. I typed his name into the system and started the paperwork for an emergency appeal. I wasn't a scared kid anymore. I was the architect of the fallout. And as I started to type, I felt a strange sense of peace. Miller was wrong about a lot of things, but he was right about one. The sidewalk wasn't my living room. The courtroom was. And I was just getting started. The office was a blur of activity, but I felt like I was moving through deep water. The sound of ringing phones and the frantic clicking of keyboards felt miles away. I stared at the blinking cursor on my screen, the name of the boy from that morning, Andre Lawson, staring back at me. He was 19, just 19. Miller had given him 2 years for a baggie of marijuana that wouldn't even be illegal in the next state over. I could still see the look on Andre's face, that hollow, extinguished expression of someone who had realized the game was rigged before he'd even learned the rules. A shadow fell across my desk. I looked up to see a man in a sharp, slate-gray suit. He didn't work for the bar. He had that $10,000 retainer look about him. Slick-back hair, a watch that cost more than my car, and eyes that were constantly scanning for a weakness. "Miss Jenkins-Ross," he said. It wasn't a question, it was an accusation. "I'm Robert Vance. I represent Judge Miller." I didn't stand up. I didn't even stop typing for a second. "He's quick. I'll give him that." I figured he'd wait at least until the sun went down before sending in the cavalry. Vance pulled out the chair opposite me and sat down without being asked. He leaned in, lowering his voice to that confidential tone lawyers use when they're about to offer you a deal that tastes like poison. "Maya, may I call you Maya? We're all professionals here. My client is a man of high standing who has dedicated 30 years to this city. One afternoon of, let's call it, colorful language shouldn't negate a lifetime of service." I stopped typing then. I slowly turned my head to look at him. Colorful language? He told me I belonged with a mop and a bucket. He told me I couldn't read. He called an entire demographic a drain on the system. "That's not color, Mr. Vance, that's a stain, and it's not coming out." Vance didn't flinch. He just smiled, a thin, rehearsed curve of the lips. "The Bar Association doesn't want a public trial. The optics are terrible for everyone. Think about it. If we go to a full hearing, we're going to have to look into the ethics of your sting. We're going to look into your background, your history, your every social media post since 2010. It'll be a circus." Or, the judge resigns quietly. He keeps his pension. The tape stays in a sealed file. Everyone wins. I felt a coldness settle in my chest. This was how it happened. This was how men like Miller stayed in power for 30 years. They didn't do it alone. They did it with a phalanx of men in gray suits who turned systemic racism into optics and negotiations. You think this is about a win? I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. You think I spent 3 days being humiliated so I could help your client secure a comfortable retirement? I'm saying you should be smart, Vance whispered. You've made your point. You've had your hero moment. Don't ruin a promising career by being an idealist. The world isn't a movie, Maya. I leaned forward, mirroring his posture. I could smell his expensive cologne, something woody and arrogant. You're right, Mr. Vance. The world isn't a movie. In a movie, there'd be a soundtrack. In real life, there's just the sound of a 19-year-old boy's heart breaking when he hears he's going to prison for no reason. There's just the sound of a woman crying in the second row because she knows her grandson never stood a chance. I stood up then, my chair scraping loudly against the floor. People in the office turned to look. I didn't care. Get out of my office, I said. And tell your client that I'm not interested in a quiet resignation. I want a public hearing. I want that tape played on every local news station. I want every person he's ever sentenced to know that the man who judged them was a fraud. And as for my promising career, if it ends because I refuse to bury the truth, then it wasn't a career worth having. Vance's face hardened. The mask of professional courtesy dropped, revealing the shark underneath. You're making a mistake, a very loud, very public mistake. I'll take my chances, I said. As he walked away, his heels clicking sharply on the linoleum, Marcus came over. He'd heard the whole thing. He looked at me with a mixture of pride and genuine concern. You know he's right about one thing, Maya. They're going to come for you now. They're going to try to turn you into the villain. I looked down at the file on my screen. Andre Lawson. I thought about the way Miller had laughed at me. I thought about the weight of that gavel. Let them come, I said. I've spent the last 3 days being someone I'm not. I'm actually looking forward to showing them who I am. I went back to the paperwork. I had an appeal to write, a boy to get out of jail, and a judge to finish dismantling. The circus was coming to town, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of the lions. The morning of the public hearing felt like the air before a thunderstorm. Heavy, electric, the kind of day where you can feel the humidity sticking to your skin, making everything feel just a little more desperate. I stood in front of the mirror in the Bar Association restroom, smoothing down a dark navy suit that felt like armor. I looked at the dark sea, Urkel's under my eyes. I hadn't slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard Miller's laughter. I heard the sound of that gavel. The hallway leading to the hearing room was packed. It wasn't just the press anymore. There were activists with signs, law students with notebooks, and most importantly, the people from the neighborhood. I saw the woman from the second row of the courtroom, the one who had squeezed my hand. She was wearing her Sunday best. When she saw me, she didn't say a word. She just nodded once. That nod was worth more than any legal degree I held. As I walked into the room, I saw Miller. He wasn't on the bench today. He was sitting at a small table with Robert Vance, looking remarkably small without his black robes. He looked like a man who had suddenly realized he was mortal. He wouldn't look at me. He kept staring at a yellow legal pad, scribbling notes that I knew were just a way to keep his hands from shaking. The chairperson of the commission, a formidable woman named Justice Holloway, tapped her microphone. This hearing is now in session. We are here to review the conduct of Judge David Miller. The first hour was a blur of procedural motions. Vance tried everything. He tried to have the recordings thrown out. He tried to argue that my presence was a form of entrapment. He tried to paint me as a radical with an agenda, but Holloway wasn't having it. She sat there like a mountain, immovable and cold. "Mr. Vance," she said, her voice cutting through his jargon like a hot knife. The evidence was gathered under a sanctioned oversight operation. We are going to hear the audio. Now. The room went dark. The only light came from the glowing red play button on the technician's console. And then, the voice filled the room. A lawyer? You? Maya, let's be realistic. The only way you're getting into a law firm is with a mop and a bucket. The sound of Miller's voice, so casual, so certain, hit the room like a physical blow. I looked around. I saw a young man in the back row put his head in his hands. I saw the members of the commission leaning back, their faces twisted in a mixture of shock and disgust. I doubt you can even read the titles. Maybe you can practice your opening statements for the guards. They love a good joke. When the audio finished, the silence was deafening. It wasn't the silence of a courtroom. It was the silence of a wake. Miller was slumped in his chair, his face a ghostly white. Vance was looking at the ceiling, probably already calculating how to distance himself from the wreckage. "Miss Jenkins-Ross," Holloway said softly, "would you like to make a statement?" I stood up. I didn't go to the podium. I stayed right where I was, looking directly at the man who had tried to erase me. "For 3 days, I pretended to be someone Judge Miller thought was beneath him," I began. My voice was steady, but it carried the weight of every person he'd ever silenced. I felt the contempt. I felt the way he used the law not as a shield, but as a weapon to maintain a hierarchy he felt was natural. But the thing about the law is that it doesn't belong to the man in the robe, it belongs to the people. I looked toward the back of the room. I've spent the last 48 hours reviewing cases. I saw names, hundreds of them. People who were told they were nothing. People who were told their futures didn't matter. This isn't just about one judge's bias. It's about the fact that for 30 years, we let him believe he was right. I turned back to the commission. Justice isn't just about the verdict. It's about the process. And when the process is infected with the idea that some lives are worth less than others, the verdict is a lie. I asked this commission not just for a removal, but for a full audit of every decision made in that courtroom for the last decade. Miller finally looked up. His eyes were wet. For a second, I thought I saw regret, but then I realized it was just fear. Fear of the vacuum that opens up when power is stripped away. I was a good judge," he whispered. It wasn't meant for the microphone, but in that silent room, we all heard it. "No," I said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You were just a man with a hammer who forgot that people aren't nails." The verdict from the commission didn't come immediately, but the atmosphere in the city had already shifted. You could feel it in the air, that sense of a long-overdue storm finally breaking. I spent the next 2 weeks in a windowless room at the Bar Association, surrounded by towers of manila folders. These were Miller's disposables, the cases he'd hurried through, the lives he'd signed away between coffee breaks. Each file was a person. Each staple held together a story that had been cut short. The headline finally hit the stands on a Tuesday morning. "Commission strips Miller of judicial powers, all past rulings under review." I wasn't in the office when it broke. I was standing in the cold, gray shadow of the county jail. The heavy iron gates groaned as they slid open, a sound that usually meant someone was being locked away from the world. But today, the direction was different. A young man walked out, squinting against the sudden brightness of the afternoon sun. He was wearing the same clothes he'd been arrested in, a wrinkled t-shirt and jeans that hung a little looser on his frame than they had 2 weeks ago. Andre Lawson took 3 steps onto the sidewalk and stopped. He looked at the sky like he'd never seen it before. "Andre," I said, stepping forward. He turned, his eyes searching my face. He recognized me, not as the Maya in the hoodie, but as the woman who had stood up in that hearing and spoke his name into a microphone when the world was watching. He didn't say thank you. He couldn't. His throat moved as he swallowed hard, and he just stood there, trembling slightly in the wind. "Your record is being vacated," I told him, my voice softening. "The bar is providing you with a scholarship fund for that vocational program you wanted to join. It's not enough to make up for the time, I know, but it's a start." Andre looked down at his hands, then back at the jail behind him. "He really thought I was nothing," he whispered. I started to believe him, you know? Sitting in that cell, I started to think maybe he was right. Maybe I was just born to be in there. "He was a liar, Andre," I said firmly. "He was a man who used a title to hide his own smallness. Don't let his ghost live in your head." He nodded slowly, a small, tentative smile finally breaking through the exhaustion on his face. He walked toward a waiting car where his mother was already sobbing, her arms outstretched. I watched them embrace, a private moment of healing in a very public war. Later that evening, I went back to the courthouse. It was late, and the building was mostly empty. The cleaning crews were buffing the floors, the rhythmic whir-whir of the machines echoing through the marble halls. I walked up to courtroom 4B. The gold lettering on the door, Judge David Miller, had already been scraped off. There was just a faint, ghostly outline of where the name used to be. I pushed the door open and walked inside. It was dark, the only light coming from the street lamps outside filtering through the high windows. I walked up to the bench, the place that had felt like a mountain peak when I was sitting at the defense table. I climbed the steps and sat in the high-backed leather chair. It was just a chair. It didn't make me taller. It didn't make me smarter. It was just a piece of furniture in a room built by people. I looked out at the empty gallery, imagining the hundreds of faces that had stared up at this spot with terror and hope. I thought about the responsibility of it, the sheer terrifying weight of holding someone's freedom in your hands. Miller had collapsed under that weight, turning his fear into cruelty. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A text from Marcus: "We start the audit on the next district tomorrow. You ready?" I looked at the mahogany desk, at the spot where the gavel used to rest. I realized then that the sting wasn't the end of my job, it was the beginning. There were other Millers out there, other courtrooms where the air was stale and the truth was a luxury. I stood up, leaving the shadows of the bench behind. I walked out of the courtroom, my heels clicking a steady, confident rhythm on the marble. I didn't look back at the empty chair. I was looking toward the door, toward the city, toward the thousands of voices that were finally being heard. Justice isn't a destination. It's a constant, tiring, beautiful pursuit. And for the first time in my life, I knew exactly where I was supposed to be.